1. The fragility of modern fire. 15 seconds. That's all it takes for your fire and your safety to fail. A light drizzle hits, your storm-proof lighter dies, and suddenly you're cold, wet, and powerless. It's shocking how fragile modern fire really is. Now imagine the opposite extreme. Winter, 1632. Temperatures plunging to -20. A Swedish army of 12,000 men pushes through the frozen forests of Germany. No barracks, no supply lines, no second chances. In that world, losing fire meant dying before morning. Yet those soldiers made flames that cut through blizzards, while ours die in light rain. Why? Because they possessed something we've forgotten: true fire literacy. The physics, biology, and discipline of creating heat when nature wants you dead. Today we're opening that forgotten manual. You'll see how a single log became a self-feeding furnace, how a fungus became a month-long ember bank, and why medieval ignition methods still outperform modern gear in storms. If the power grid failed tonight, could you make a fire that lives? Let's find out. 2. The Swedish Torch. The 17th century combustion engine. When your campfire dies in the rain, it feels almost personal. You gather the wood, strike the flame, coax the ember, and then the first drop falls. The ground steals your heat, the moisture smothers your spark, and the fire collapses before it ever has a chance to live. But 4 centuries ago, in the darkest winters of the 30 Years' War, Swedish soldiers found a way to make fire that didn't just survive storms, it thrived inside them. They called it the Swedish Torch. And to understand why it worked, you have to picture what they faced. Snow driving sideways, winds ripping across frozen valleys, and men who knew that without reliable heat, dawn would become a death sentence. They couldn't afford a weak flame, they needed a machine. So they built one from a single log. They stood it upright, carved deep vertical slits from the top, and transformed a chunk of wood into a chimney of controlled destruction. This was no ordinary fire. It was a self-ventilating combustion engine forged from the physics of nature itself. Inside that upright log, a powerful phenomenon awakened, what we now call the stack effect. As the fire at the top roared, the rising heat pulled cold air upward through the slits, feeding the flames with a relentless stream of oxygen. The log breathed like a living thing, even in rain, even in wind, even with unseasoned green wood that would normally hiss and die. The wooden walls shielded the heart of the fire, the airflow fed it with precision, and the temperature climbed so high that the moisture inside the log was driven out as steam. What the modern camper calls impossible, the Swedish soldier called Tuesday. And here's the lesson for you today. Most people build their fire flat on the ground, letting the cold earth pull away every bit of precious heat. In wet weather, that mistake is fatal. Elevation is survival. When you raise your fire on a platform of logs or inside a torch structure, you separate its heat from the freezing, hungry soil beneath it. You give the flame a chance to breathe, and in doing so, you give yourself a chance to endure. The Swedish torch wasn't just a clever trick. It was a reminder of something we too often forget. Fire is not an accident. It is engineered. And when nature turns hostile, the people who understand that will outlast those who don't. Stay with me, because the deeper we go, the more you'll see how medieval soldiers used biology, chemistry, and sheer discipline to summon fire in storms that would extinguish the modern world. 3rd, the biological fire battery, Amadou and the 5,000-year-old secret. Before a fire can roar, before it can warm a frozen soldier or save a life in the dark, it must first be born. And that moment, the spark, is always the most fragile. In a blizzard, when snow is cutting sideways and the wind is stripping the heat from your fingers, a spark is almost impossible to keep alive. Modern butane lighters freeze, matches snap. Ferro rods throw sparks that vanish instantly in the wind. But medieval soldiers had something different. They carried Amadou, a fire starter so powerful, so reliable, and so ancient that it predates recorded history. We learned its secret from a man who never lived long enough to tell his story. Ötzi the Iceman, frozen into the Alps for over 5,000 years, was found lying in a cradle of ice with an arrow in his back. Yet even in death, he clutched his most precious possession, a fire kit. And inside that kit was a strange leathery material, the processed inner flesh of the horse hoof fungus, the same material medieval soldiers relied on 15 centuries later. To them, Amadou wasn't just tinder, it was a biological fire battery. They would take the inner trauma layer of the fungus, boil it in wood ash lye, or even stale urine to saturate it with nitrates, then pound it until the fibers loosened into a soft, suede-like mat. What they created was something close to magic. Thousands of microscopic chambers of cellulose and lignin, perfectly spaced to breathe oxygen and cradle heat. A piece no bigger than a tennis ball could hold a smoldering ember not for minutes, not for hours, but for weeks, sometimes even a month. Imagine that, a fire you can store, a fire you can carry, a fire that sleeps, waiting to be awakened with nothing more than a single spark. And this is where the contrast becomes almost embarrassing for us. Our modern matches grow brittle in the cold. Our lighters refuse to ignite when chilled. But Amadou? When a spark lands on it, it doesn't flash and die. It glows, it deepens, it spreads like a heartbeat. And the wind we fear, the wind that kills your lighter, actually feeds the ember, making it hotter and brighter. This wasn't luck or magic, it was engineering, ancient biological engineering that our ancestors mastered long before steel, butane, or waterproof matches. And the lesson is simple. If you control the ember, you control the fire. And if you can carry the ember through the storm, you can outlive the night. Stay with me, because next we uncover why medieval ignition methods succeed precisely where modern convenience fails, and why understanding that difference could save your life when everything else stops working. Fourth, percussion versus convenience, why your lighter fails. There is a quiet betrayal built into modern firemaking. We trust our lighters because they feel effortless. A thumb flick, a tiny spark, a small flame, and we assume the fire will obey. But the moment the weather turns hostile, when the rain begins, when the cold tightens its grip, that convenience collapses faster than we expect. The truth is painfully simple. Your lighter doesn't fail because you're unlucky. It fails because physics is relentless. Water carries an enormous latent heat of vaporization. That means the instant your lighter's flame touches damp wood, every bit of its energy is stolen to evaporate the moisture instead of igniting the fuel. A drizzle becomes a thief. A wet log becomes a heat sink that drains the flame before it even has a chance to grow. And then the temperature drops, and your own body joins the enemy. In extreme cold, your vessels constrict to protect your core. Blood leaves your fingers, turning them clumsy, numb, and nearly useless. Try rolling the tiny wheel on a plastic lighter when your hands are shaking so hard you can't feel your own skin. It borders on impossible. Modern tools require fine motor control. Blizzards take that away. But medieval soldiers didn't rely on convenience. They relied on certainty. Their ignition method, flint and steel, was brutally simple and brutally reliable. A steel striker held in a gloved or numb hand. A sharp stone swung with the power of the arm and shoulder. Large muscles, big movements, no delicate parts, no fuel to run out, no button to freeze, and no care whatsoever about whether the tool had just been dropped in snow, water, mud, or blood. Steel doesn't mind the cold. Stone doesn't jam. And the spark they produce burns at temperatures far hotter than the tiny flame of a lighter. This was the genius of percussion firemaking. It didn't require dexterity. It didn't require ideal weather. It didn't require luck. It required knowledge, rhythm, and the understanding that survival tools must work when the body cannot. And today, the lesson echoes louder than ever. When you trade reliability for convenience, you borrow safety on credit, and the storm always collects. Stay with me, because next we explore how medieval soldiers found fuel even when everything around them was soaked, frozen, or dead, and how those choices turned the impossible into a roaring flame. 5. Nature's napalm, sourcing the widowmakers. When everything around you is soaked, when the forest floor squelches under your boots, and every fallen branch feels like a sponge, most people believe fire is impossible. But medieval soldiers knew better. They understood that the fire you need is rarely the fire you can see. It hides above you, waiting, dry and deadly. They searched for what they called standing deadwood, or more ominously, widowmakers. These were dead branches that clung high in the canopy, untouched by rain, untouched by melting snow, suspended in the dry air where moisture could not reach them. A single blow could bring one down, and inside that pale, weathered wood was the driest fuel in the entire battlefield. But even that wasn't enough when the storms turned savage. So soldiers carried two secret weapons, materials so powerful that they behaved almost like natural accelerants. The first was fatwood, the resin-soaked heart of old pine. When a pine tree dies, its sap retreats to the core and hardens into thick, amber-rich resin. That resin is 80% fuel by weight. Even soaked in rain, even buried in snow, fatwood burns with a hot, oily flame that shrugs off moisture like it isn't even there. Light it once, and it becomes a torch, spitting sparks and heat strong enough to dry the rest of your fuel. To a soldier freezing in the dark, fatwood wasn't firewood, it was life insurance. And the second was birch bark. Peel a sheet of birch and you'll smell it instantly, the sharp, clean scent of betulin oil. This natural compound ignites with astonishing ease and burns even when the bark is dripping wet. It curls into a tight, papery cradle that shelters flame from wind, acting like a waterproof matchbox long before matchboxes existed. For soldiers marching through frozen valleys, a handful of birch bark was worth more than a flask of lamp oil and far more reliable than anything we carry today. These weren't just tricks, they were survival instincts, an intimate knowledge of how the forest stores its fire, even in the worst winter. And the lesson for us is immediate. If the ground fails you, look up. If the weather tries to drown your fire, reach for fuel that refuses to die. Because out there in the wild, nature doesn't just offer obstacles, it offers weapons, if you know where to look. Stay with me. Next, we turn to one of the darkest warnings in fire history, when an army that did know these secrets still perished because they failed to protect the flame. 6th, the cost of forgetting, the Carolean Death March. History has a cruel way of punishing those who forget the fundamentals, and nowhere is that lesson sharper or colder than in the winter of 1719. The Great Northern War was nearing its end when 6,000 Swedish Carolean soldiers began what should have been a routine retreat across the tidal mountains. They were trained, they were disciplined, and they carried the hard-earned knowledge of generations who had mastered fire in the worst winters on Earth. But knowledge means nothing if it isn't protected. As the column climbed into the high passes, the sky collapsed into a violent blizzard. Snow hammered sideways, winds screamed through the valleys. Temperatures plunged so fast that breath froze mid-air. And in that chaos, the smallest mistakes became fatal. Their tinder kits were soaked. Their standing deadwood scouts were cut off by whiteout conditions. Every spark they tried to make died instantly in the screaming wind. Without fire, the cold showed no mercy. 3,000 men, half the force, froze to death in a single night. It wasn't the muskets of their enemies that killed them. It wasn't a lost battle, or a failed tactic, or poor leadership. It was the loss of the flame. the simple, brutal consequence of forgetting that fire is not just warmth. Fire is survival. Fire is discipline. Fire is life. The Carolean Death March stands as a warning carved into ice. You cannot bargain with winter. You cannot negotiate with the cold. You either guard your fire literacy like a weapon, or you pay for its absence in blood. And as we move to the final chapter, we'll see why this forgotten knowledge matters far beyond the battlefield. Because in any storm, ancient or modern, the question has never changed. Can you make fire when nature tries to take everything from you? Stay with me. The conclusion may change the way you see fire forever. 7th. Conclusion. Are you a master or a consumer? In the end, our ancestors didn't survive because they were tougher or braver or blessed with luck. They survived because they remembered. They treated fire not as a convenience, but as a discipline. They lived by an unwritten rule. Spend most of your effort preparing, gathering fatwood, crafting amadou, keeping tinder bone dry, and spend only a fraction on the spark itself. Today, we do the opposite. We stand over damp sticks, clicking a lighter 100 times, hoping for magic. We've traded mastery for ease. We've surrendered literacy for convenience. And the moment the weather turns hostile, that trade becomes painfully clear. In a medieval camp, the position of fire master was sacred. One person carried the responsibility of keeping thousands alive. They knew fire was more than heat. Fire was morale. Fire was medicine. Fire was the thin, glowing line between life and death on a winter night. They didn't rely on luck, because luck burns out fast. So the real question now is simple and uncomfortable. If the power grid failed tonight and the storm outside was tearing the world apart, would you know how to make a single log breathe? Would you know where to find the fire hidden inside the tree? Would you remember what the soldiers, shepherds, hunters, and wanderers of the past carried in their bones? Because nature doesn't care about your lighter, or your buttons, or your gadgets. Fire is a science, yes, but it is also a memory humanity carried for thousands of years, and one we have nearly forgotten. So learn it again, carry it again, not in your pocket, but in your hands, your instincts, your preparation. Thank you for watching Historia Prime. If this journey into forgotten fire literacy helped you see the world differently, consider subscribing to support more stories like this. Stay warm, stay curious, and remember, the ember never forgets. Before we close, let me leave you with one final image. Starting a fire in a blizzard is like sieging a fortress. You don't throw pebbles at the wall and hope it collapses. That's your lighter on wet wood. You build a siege engine, the Swedish Torch. You find the weak point in the defenses, standing dead wood waiting above the snow. And you send in a silent infiltrator, the glowing ember of amadou that slips through the cracks and opens the gate from within. Fire is a battle, and as history has shown, only those who prepare ever win.